Hey, what's up everybody? Dustin here with Rocky Mountain ATV MC, and today I'll be showing you how to diagnose the starting system and replace the starter motor if necessary on a KTM dirt bike. The starter motor is an electric motor that cranks the engine over using power from the battery. And just like many other components on our machines, well, it can wear out over a period of time and use. So today we're going to show you how to replace the starter motor and how to identify some of the associated components in the starting system and how to inspect them on a 2015 KTM 300 XCW. To do this job, you're just going to need a few basic hand tools, a multimeter, some grease, some rubber gloves, rags, safety glasses, contact cleaner, and some Scotch-Brite. Now, as far as replacement parts go, we've got some gaskets, bushings, replacement BENDIX, and a starter motor from Nuetron. Now, depending on what's causing the issues with your bike, if you just want to inspect it at minimum, you'll at least want to pick up some gaskets and some replacement bushings. And as always, before working on your machine, always be sure to reference your service manual for proper procedures, torque specs, and safety information. Keep in mind that all of the OEM parts, including the gaskets, bushings, and compensating washers, can be found on our website in the OEM diagrams. So if your bike starter is having some issues, well, it could be caused by a number of different components. So if you hit your start button and it just makes a clicking noise and nothing actually happens, or when you hit the start button you hear a really weird noise that's coming from the area of the starter motor but it doesn't actually crank over the engine, or when you hit the starter button and nothing actually happens, well, we're going to cover some quick steps on diagnosing it. First things first, before you begin your diagnostics, you want to make sure that you have a good battery. So take your voltmeter, take a measurement from your battery, and you want to be measuring at or around 13 volts DC. Now, if you're not measuring at least that, you'll want to throw your battery on a trickle charger and make sure that the battery's in good condition. Now, if your battery's in bad shape, right now would be a good time to just go ahead and replace it. If your battery's in good shape, you can move on to the starter solenoid. Now on this bike, it's located inside of the air box underneath the battery tray. Now a good way to tell if it's working is when you hit the start button, you should be able to hear an audible click. Now when you hit the start button, if your starter motor begins to crank over, odds are the starter relay's in good shape. However, if the starter motor does not crank over when you hit the start button, but you still hear the audible click coming from the solenoid, odds are it's still in good shape. If you'd like more in-depth information on how to test the solenoid, check out our how-to video. Now from the starter solenoid, there's a lead that runs directly to the starter motor's terminal. Now one way to tell if we're getting voltage to the starter motor would be to hook up a test light and connect one end to the terminal, hit the start button. And if the test light illuminates, then everything above the starter motor is in good shape. Now the next step would be to check our starter motor. Now if everything that we've tested above is in good shape and we hit the starter button, but the starter motor still doesn't turn over, odds are it's your starter motor. However, if you hit the start button and the starter motor does begin to spin but doesn't crank the engine over, or it begins to make a really loud noise in here, odds are it's probably the BENDIX. So you may want to look into replacing the BENDIX and some of the other associated components. But really, in order to tell what's going on from this point, we're going to take this assembly apart. To begin, start by removing the battery's negative cable. Disconnect cable from the starter motor. Remove starter motor cover. Now once you've got this cover removed, chances are it's going to be really dirty, so go ahead and give it a good cleaning before we disassemble it any further. Remove the two bolts that secure the starter motor to the engine. Remove the starter motor. Remove the two bolts on the outer ignition cover. Remove the cover. When removing the cover, be aware of the gasket, the dowel pin, and the starter idler gear. Remove the three remaining bolts on the alternator cover. Remove the alternator cover. Remove the gasket and dowels. Now it looks like our BENDIX has decided to come out with the cover. So it'll either come out with the cover or it will remain inside on the engine case just like that. So we can remove this, set this aside, be mindful of the dowel pins as well when you remove it, make sure you keep track of those, and then remove the BENDIX. With all of the parts removed, be sure to clean all of the parts. Clean the gasket surfaces and the stator rotor. Now while you're cleaning your parts, you want to give them a good inspection. One thing in particular you will definitely want to inspect are these bushings. Now there are 4 in total. We've got 2 of them that sit in the ignition cover, 1 that sits in the outer cover, and 1 that sits inside of the engine's case. Now when you're inspecting these, there's like an orange Teflon that's coated on the inner diameter, And once that wears through, you should be able to see metal. Now, if you see metal showing through the orange Teflon, you'll definitely want to replace these. Now, for today, we're just going to go ahead and replace them for good measure. Now, right here at our engine's case, you can see that our bushing is totally gone. Not quite sure what happened to it. Must have got chewed up in the motor. Obviously, there is some evidence of this. Now, so that we can be thorough in our cleaning and inspection, we're gonna go ahead and be removing the stator rotor. Now, you don't have to do this at home, but you can just to be thorough. Now, while we're here at the rotor, you'll also want to inspect the teeth to make sure that none of them are broken, none of the teeth are missing, and if it looks like there's really extreme or excessive wear, mushrooming of the teeth, you'll definitely want to replace the stator rotor as well. And there it is. There's our missing bushing. So we're going to go ahead and get this cleaned up, and then we'll move on to inspecting some of the other parts. If you had to remove your stator rotor in order to clean behind it, when it comes to reinstalling it, be sure to reference your service manual for that proper torque spec. For this bike, it's 44.3 foot-pounds. Make sure to clean and inspect your idler gear as well. So this here is the BENDIX. It will free spin in one direction and expand and open in the other. This is what engages the stator rotor, in turn cranking over your engine. I'd say most of the time when you're experiencing some sort of problem with the starting components on these KTMs, this is more often than not going to be the problem, or the starter motor will have failed on its own. Now, this one's still in good shape. However, we did have the failure with the bushing, so just for good measure, we'll be replacing the BENDIX. Now, when it comes to replacing the bushings, how you replace them is you can use a drill bit like this that's just barely larger than the inner diameter of the bushing. Now, you're going to press in and twist so that you can grip onto the bushing itself, and once you've got a good grip with the drill bit, you can pull it free. Now, when it comes to installing the new bushing, you can just set it in there with your finger. And then you're going to want to take like a socket or something that can distribute the pressure evenly against the face of the bushing and set it into place. Now, when you're driving the bushing into place, you want to take your time with this and be careful. You want to keep the bushing as square as possible and get it set. Then you will want to repeat the same steps for extracting and installing the new bushings for the remaining 3 bushings. Now, if you're still just not sure if your starter motor is good or bad, what you can do to test it is you can connect a set of jumper cables to your battery, connect the other end of the negative to the body on the starter's motor, then you can take the positive end and connect it to the terminal. Now, by doing this, we're applying voltage directly to the starter motor, and this is simulating us basically pushing the starting button. So as you can see, ours is still in good shape. It's still working. Now we're going to go ahead and replace ours since we have a new replacement from Nuetron. However, if you are going to reuse your starter motor and it's still in good shape, you will want to look into replacing this O-ring. Now, the last thing that we need to check for is the gear lash or gear mesh between the starter idler gear and the starter itself. So we will need to install the starter motor into the ignition's cover. Before you do that, be sure to grease the O-ring with some grease, and then we can install the starter idler gear along with the cover plate and gasket. When installing these fasteners, make sure to torque them to 5.9 foot-pounds. Now, for this last bolt, obviously it goes all the way through and there are no threads on the other side, but you can still take the same bolt that came from that location. You're going to take a nut, place it onto the back side of it, so that way we can establish even pressure on this outer plate. You'll want to torque these fasteners to 5.9 foot-pounds. Now once you've got the outer plate installed and torqued, flip this around so that you can see the teeth on the gear. Now you'll want to use a pick tool or something like this to move the idler gear back and forth. Now you should have just a little bit of play inside of there, but you do not want that amount of play to exceed more than half the width of one of these gear teeth. If it does, you will want to add a compensating washer to the starter idler gear in order to compensate for that play. You'll have to reinstall the outer cover, torque the fasteners, and then recheck this. Ours looks like we're in pretty good shape. With all of our parts cleaned, bushings replaced, and our gear lash checked on the starter motor and idler gear, we can go ahead and remove the outer cover, idler gear, then we can remove our starter motor. Now on to assembly. Take some grease and apply it to the teeth on the stator rotor. Apply grease to the teeth on the BENDIX. Then we can install the BENDIX into the bushing. Install the ignition cover gasket with dowels. Then we can install the stator cover or ignition cover. Be mindful that this part of the BENDIX will need to engage the bushing that's inside of the cover, so be careful when doing this. Install the 3 fasteners on the ignition cover or stator cover. Torque them to 5.9 foot-pounds. Grease the starter idler gear teeth. Next we can install the starter idler gear along with the outer cover and gasket. Install the 2 fasteners. Torque to 5.9 foot-pounds. If you haven't already, you'll want to grease the starter's O-ring. Then we can position the new Nuetron starter motor into the ignition cover. Next we can mount the 2 bolts for the starter motor and torque them to 5.9 foot-pounds. Next we can connect the starter motor cable. Position and mount the cover, insert the bolts, and torque them to 5.9 foot-pounds. Lastly, we can reinstall the battery's cable. Then you can test it and make sure that the bike starts and runs. And that's it. Maintaining and or replacing some damaged parts inside of the starting system will definitely help you to keep your bike starting and running smoothly. Now we recommend that you at least tear into this once a year, pull the parts out, clean them, give them a good inspection, replace parts if necessary, then grease it up and put it back together. This will definitely help you to keep these parts in good condition for a long time. Now, if you have any questions as to what we've done here today, feel free to leave us a comment below and we'll be sure to get an answer back to you. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more product spotlights, how-tos, and top 5s, and also see our website at RockyMountainATVMC.com where you can find all the replacement parts that we used here today, as well as many more for your motorcycle, ATV, and side-by-side. I'm Dustin with Rocky Mountain. Thanks for watching and keep the wrenches turning.